Yeah, so we had a couple things sort of following up from the Active Inference Symposium and then something that was put in the Slack. So this is the first thing I want to talk about. So this is Active Inference related. This is Alexander Shaw, who I don't think was at the symposium, but does a lot of stuff that we've talked about with Active Inference and this computational psychiatry approach.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
yeah,
and yeah, I can talk about some other papers that he's been publishing just like this month.
yeah,
That relevant to the what is intelligence reading group that we just did this week too.
Okay.
Anyway, sorry to keep going.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah. So this is a neuro-inspired computational framework for AGI, predictive coding, active inference, and free energy minimization. So this is a recent preprint. The abstract. This paper proposes that foundational principles from theoretical neuroscience / predictive coding, the free energy principle, and variational inference offer a biologically grounded framework for artificial general intelligence. These approaches characterize the brain as a hierarchical inference system that continuously updates beliefs and selects actions to minimize uncertainty and surprise. In contrast to conventional AI systems, which typically rely on static architectures and offline training, biological agents engage in active generative inference within dynamic, uncertain environments. We argue that it is the inference-based architecture, not just its behavioral outputs, that underpins the adaptability, generalization, and resilience of natural intelligence. So it's this ability to do inference rather than just having this standard behavioral output that they kind of isolate as the key to this. We outline a neuro-inspired computational framework built on hierarchical generative models, scalable variational inference, like variational Laplace, and active inference. Finally, we contrast this approach with dominant deep learning paradigms and discuss its implications for building interpretable, adaptive, and autonomous machine intelligence. So they basically go over predictive coding and the free energy principle. These theories propose that perception, action, and learning arise from the hierarchical minimization of prediction error via approximate Bayesian inference. In this view, the brain is a generative model. It continuously predicts sensory inputs, updates internal beliefs in response to mismatches, and selects actions that minimize expected future surprise. So we have prediction, response to mismatches, and minimizing surprise. Those are like the three basic components of active inference. And so this forms a predictive loop. So this is a feedback loop that supports both epistemic behavior, reducing uncertainty through exploration, and instrumental behavior, pursuing preferred outcomes, achieved by internally simulating possible futures and evaluating them according to expected free energy. The underlying dynamics are governed by a variational principle. And this is also important in active inference. And when they say variational, they mean that the brain minimizes a quantity called variational free energy, a bound on model evidence, providing unified explanation for learning, adaptation, and action selection under uncertainty. So variational free energy is defined by this term here, which is where the QZ is the approximate posterior, PZ given X is the true posterior, and then PX is the model evidence. So you have basically the posterior given model evidence, and then the approximate posterior given the true posterior given model evidence. And then you subtract log model evidence, and then you have your KL divergence and that's your function that you're basically minimizing, which is your variational free energy. Minimizing this bound approximates Bayesian inference in a tractable way. So this is the bound that we're talking about. Meanwhile, artificial intelligence has made rapid progress in areas such as transformer-based large language models, diffusion-based generative models, and reinforcement learning agents. So these are all kind of relevant things. Interestingly, in the open source, the presentation I gave on open source sustainability, I focused a lot on the reinforcement learning models that we've been doing, and kind of relating that to active inference and some of the things. And we've done some active inference in the past, but there's some interesting sort of mathematical relationships in the models that we've been using with active inference. And so that's something I think we should follow up on, especially given kind of what we're trying to do in terms of solve a collective behavioral problem and how to best approach that. This also is very interesting in terms of the post-transformer model landscape that we were talking about for the last 2 weeks, where we're thinking about how to move beyond transformers or how to improve upon transformers as that step in a large language model or some other way to kind of overcome the limitations of those models. So this is where I think that's what they're maybe kind of posing for active inference, that it's sort of better than a transformer-based approach. But that's something I guess that they're going to get into later in the paper. So then they kind of point out the limitations of modern models that are currently used. So that's like transformer-based models, also diffusion models and reinforcement learning agents. These systems often struggle to generalize beyond their training distribution, adapt online, or robustly handle uncertainty. And so one of the problems, of course, is that they typically lack explicit generative models of the environment and rely on static architectures trained via supervised or reinforcement learning. So reinforcement learning, say, for example, is good for learning kind of immediate sorts of rewards and policies, but it's not good at like that sort of world model approach where you need to model the world so you don't have to have been trained on everything to get the gist of the context. So this is kind of a long-standing question in cognitive science, which is, how do we put things into a framework? How do you have a general idea of where things fit into the world, despite maybe not having experience with a specific thing? Where do you fit that into the world? We can do that pretty easily as sort of, when we're in a context, we have this sort of intuitive sense of where something goes, and that's not something you see in machine intelligence. So this is kind of an interesting thing. It's not something you can get with diffusion models. It's not something you can get reinforcement models, and not transformer models. So yeah, and then we talked actually, in our paper on the Evergood regulator theorem, we talked about diffusion-based models and sort of how you can maybe use the Evergood regulator as a means to get to a world model based on these kind of problems where you have like a diffusion-based approach, and then you can generalize from that. So that's something that is maybe an interesting area. But what they're arguing here is that you need to have an explicit generative model, and of course they're going to put in, they're going to plug in basically variational free energy as that generative model. This paper explores the emerging hypothesis that the computational principles underlying brain function, predictive coding, dynamical systems modeling, and active inference may provide a biologically grounded blueprint for constructing general-purpose agents. We argue that such agents should not merely reproduce intelligent behavior, but embody the same self-organizing, inference-based principles that underlie human cognition. To develop this argument, we proceed as follows. First, we examine the brain as an inference engine, showing how hierarchical predictive coding and active inference give rise to perception, action, and learning. Next, we contrast this with prevailing AI paradigms, particularly transformer and diffusion-based models, highlighting their strengths and limitations. We then present the free energy principle and variational Laplace, which is going to be a variation on variational free energy, as scalable engines for neuro-inspired AI. And then they propose a roadmap for AGI based on this way of doing things. So there's this model of general intelligence, and this is where we view perception, cognition, and action as the outcomes of approximate Bayesian inference embedded in a dynamical system. And so this allows us to have a model where we are able to approximate the world, anticipate it, and select actions that reduce uncertainty. Okay. So we want to have this hierarchical generative model. There's this, they kind of argue the brain is a hierarchical architecture that can, basically have each level generate predictions about the activity of the level below. Sensory signals are explained away by these top-down predictions, and only residual errors are propagated upward. So they approach this as a message-passing architecture, which supports Bayesian inference over latent variable z, given sensory observations x, under a joint generative model here. And this is just this statement here. Because exact Bayesian inference is intractable in realistic settings, the brain is assumed to represent a variational posterior QZ that approximates the true posterior PZ given x. So this is where you have this posterior that approximates the true posterior, and that's your variational form. Inference then proceeds by minimizing a variational free energy functional, which is here. This is basically what we're looking at with your variational free energy. And then minimizing free energy ensures that internal beliefs are both accurate and parsimonious, which remains close to prior expectations. This provides a trade-off between flexibility and generalization, which is essential for adaptive intelligence. Or are you going to say something, Morgan? Or?
I really do like Shaw's work, and yeah, glad we're covering it. This is still very broad strokes, though, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, we'll get a little bit into maybe like how they're applying it more generally, but it's very much I think a position piece. They're not really saying this is an example of it in a robot or something. It's just kind of like this is an alternative to.
I mean, he's definitely in the active inference camp.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's standard active inference stuff.
Like active inference has something to contribute to AGI.
Yeah.
And I like his work too. I mean, he publishes, or I shouldn't say publishes. He posts a lot of just tutorial links and like computational examples.
Yeah.
So and
yeah. Okay, this is an example of predictive coding and visual perception. So predictive coding is sort of, related to active inference in that we have this feedback loop and we're sort of estimating, things and minimizing error. So this is an example of predictive coding. Consider a simple visual scene in which a person views a cup on a table. Higher level visual areas, or inferotemporal cortex, which is the anatomical localization, generate abstract predictions such as object with a handle or familiar graspable shape. These predictions are sent down the hierarchy shaping expectations for the patterns of activity in lower level areas. So these would be like orientation edges in V1. So you have this network where there's processing in the visual system. The early parts of the visual system are represented by V1, and then later parts of the visual system are represented by inferotemporal cortex. So V1 is lower in this case, and inferotemporal is higher. And so they have this relationship where one is kind of sending information forward, and then the other is kind of giving this information back as feedback. If the incoming sensory input matches these expectations, prediction error remains low. So if the different processing in different parts of the visual stream or visual network are basically similar, there are no surprises like when you refine some of the shapes, that there's this thing that pops out, then prediction error remains low. However, if the object is partially occluded or appears unusual, say if it's a broken cup or an unexpected angle prediction, so it's like if if the visual system gets sort of the gist of what it is, but then it has some exception to it that is a problem because it might not be a cup if it's a broken cup, or it could be a cup. The visual system has to sort of and then there are other parts of the brain that participate in this. Maybe that's a critical aspect of this. Different types of other information that you can use. But in general, as you resolve the image, the main, the overall image, you get these exceptions that then can need to be resolved, basically. So this is where we get these errors that arise maybe in early visual areas and are sent upward. These errors are crucial. They signal a mismatch and prompt higher level areas to update their beliefs until the model settles on the most likely explanation, which is damaged cup. So you have lower level systems that identify the shape of a cup, and then it's most likely a cup. And then you get these exceptions that give it, provide different subsets of information. So you have these refined categories like damaged cup, and that's most likely. So it isn't necessarily always going to be damaged cup. It might look like a damaged cup, but it might actually be something else, which is maybe one of the problems here. Is it's just this approach is just simply assuming that the visual system is making this classification on its own, which this is something, of course, that may require other information. That's sort of, they talk about a priori and they talk about posterior predictions and things like that. But that of course requires, some sort of categorization, and so that's going to involve higher levels of the brain. Maybe early on, if we're doing this sort of category assessment, even in something like V1. In this way, perception operates not as passive registration, but as the brain's best guess about the hidden cause of ambiguous noisy input, allowing for rapid adaptation to new or unexpected situations. So this is, kind of reminiscent of the ambiguous figures paradigm, right? So in ambiguous figures, you have some sort of abstract shape or some shape that you can't identify right away. And, if you look at it in certain ways, it looks like maybe a duck or a pair of rabbit ears, and your visual system has to resolve that. That's, kind of just the orientation of things and how that gets interpreted and all that. So they're arguing that, you start off with these very ambiguous shapes or these ambiguous objects, and they get resolved as the visual system gains more information. But critically, the visual system has to make predictions about what that thing is, and then it goes down this path of minimizing that error. So it could be the wrong thing, it could be the wrong category, but as long as the error is minimized, it's going in that direction and it resolves it. So the idea isn't that it necessarily gets things correct. The idea is it's minimizing error, which is sort of this free energy model, minimizing energy. and then you have I don't know. I guess it's supposed to be right. Always correct. I don't know what the error rates would be, but just keep that in mind. So the idea is that this is sort of the way that this works, and of course, this is how the visual system processes information. Right? It starts with very simple patterns like stripes and blobs, and then it works its way up to details and kind of attaching semantic labels to them, which is not talked about here so much. It's just kind of minimizing things. Then they talk about active inference. Notably, predictive coding is not restricted to perception. In the framework of active inference, action selection is cast as an inferential process driven by the same imperative that governs perception, which is the minimization of expected free energy. In this view, agents do not passively infer the causes of their observations. They actively select policies that make future observations more predictable and less surprising. So again, the surprise is, if you think about this in terms of regularization or normalization, things should become more sort of towards the mean over time, more predictable. You should have less surprise. And, this is again where if you think about this in terms of a world model, things should always kind of fit into this world model. And, acquiring that sort of predictability is the job of like a Bayesian statement where we're using conditional probabilities, we're using a prior distribution, we're then taking the current observations, we're fitting it into a prior, and we're sort of normalizing all that. So ultimately nothing should be surprising, although that kind of, the Bayesian approach kind of assumes that we have perfect information, right? We have to have a prior that incorporates everything in the world. You can't have a prior that incorporates sort of, sort of a very tight distribution around the mean and then have a bunch of out of distribution observations, because those out of distribution observations won't be able to fit into that model necessarily. So the expected free energy, which is G pi under a policy pi, can be decomposed into epistemic and instrumental components, capturing both uncertainty reduction, which is exploration, and goal-directed behavior, which is exploitation. So they're putting this in a sort of a reinforcement learning cast, as you might guess. One common formulation expresses this as in this term, which is, we've seen this term before, but now we're adding in this expected free energy. And so this form reflects the expected divergence. So this is like that we saw with the KL divergence, or the log probabilities expressed, or log likelihoods expressed as KL divergence, but now we're talking about free energy. This is the expected divergence between posterior and likelihood minimizing. It encourages the agent to seek actions that simultaneously reduce uncertainty about hidden states and achieve preferred outcomes. In effect, perception and action are unified under a single inferential scheme. The brain continually infers not only what is happening, but what it should do to bring about the desired and predictable state of affairs. So this is important, because really what the point of this isn't to just classify things passively, but to provide an impetus for actions that will rectify the situation. So, if you see an ambiguous figure, if you're familiar with the paradigm, if I see like two things, if there are two options in my ambiguous perception, if I'm supposed to either see like a rabbit or a duck, and I'm talking to my person next to me, and I say, I think I see a rabbit. They say, I think I see a duck. And you're like, okay, well, let me look and see if it's a duck. Until you refocus your eyes, now you see a duck, because you're expecting that based on the communication with your neighbor. So you're doing active things in the world to sort of make a certain outcome happen. You're using this information that you're getting from this model, and you're actually acting upon it. And maybe normalizing your behavior. Maybe you're just kind of, it's helping you sort of get to the thing that you're supposed to do, or get to things that make sense, or whatever. But there's an active component here that is not something you see in your transformer models or in your diffusion models or any of that. So their approach to a world model is almost sort of like, we have to have this action component to it. And I know we talked about how people are wanting to do action models and collecting data on action models. But there is this school of thought, of course, where you just have to have behavior do things. Like, it's not a data set that you need, it's experience in the world. The agent has to have experience. It has to just kind of roam around the world and collect enough sort of experience to do something. I actually hit upon this in the spatial intelligence talk. If you watch towards the end, where part of spatial cognition isn't really building a model of the world that's perfect. It's about exploring enough of the world so that it makes conditions ergodic, or that you can sort of have a representation of every possible thing in the world, or as many possible things as you can in the world, so that they just become part of this experience, and then this world model that is, it's sort of after the experience. So it's maybe you say, well, you could just collect data for that, but it's actually more than that, because the agent actually has to have experienced being in that space, or being in that situation. So it's worth thinking about. And then this is not a new idea. Of course, people have talked about experience, and of course in embodiment we talk about experience and all of this, where you have to, it's not just about data points. It's about having that connection between using your body to do something and then having that information. It's sort of almost like a unique set of data points that you can then use to gain that knowledge or gain that model. So again, they cast this against reinforcement learning. So unlike traditional reinforcement learning, which relies on externally defined reward signals and policy optimization, active inference derives behavior from an internal generative model and an imperative to minimize variational free energy. So goals and preferences are encoded as prior beliefs about preferred states, and behavior emerges from the drive to release these states while realizing these states while reducing uncertainty. This makes active inference naturally suited to continual adaptive control. So this is continual learning and this sort of thing in uncertain environments, offering a biologically grounded alternative to model-free or value-based methods. So this is where they decompose expected free energy. So the expected free energy, G pi, which captures both uncertainty reduction, which is the epistemic value, and goal fulfillment, which is the instrumental value. And then the decomposition of this equation is where you have G pi, which equals two parts. The epistemic value, which is here, which has these conditional likelihoods under KL divergence, and looking at that. And then that's additive with instrumental value, which is this log probability, and this conditional Q. So this is basically where you have a preference. You want to reduce your uncertainty, so you want to make sure that your beliefs align with what's going on in the environment, and then those are the things you're acting upon. So it's almost like in reinforcement learning, we have a policy, and we try to find our preferred policy. So it's kind of like, I wouldn't say mushing these together, but like it's basically like leaning on the idea of instrumental value and then just optimizing that, instead of having this component of epistemic value where you have this uncertainty and you're just reducing that. So it's like, with epistemic value, if I believe something, or if I have a set of beliefs, those are epistemic things. Like if I believe things about the world, like if I believe that if I go far enough along the surface of the earth, I fall off the edge instead of coming around on my original point, because we're on a sphere instead of on a flat surface. and so I have to go out and test that. I have to go travel, and I can believe either thing, but my uncertainty is not eliminated until I actually experience that thing. I have to go out and test it. I have to go out and experience that travel, and then I know for sure, and that reduces my uncertainty about things. And you can do that with agents. If the agent sees the edge of a grid, does the agent know that the grid is toroidal, or that's the edge of the grid and they need to not go to the edge because they might get trapped? This is just thinking about a grid where you have a two-dimensional grid where you have agents exploring. Let's see, we had a question from Jesse here. Yeah, so I'm thinking about how this relates to comments like affordance and computation, to what I just said about needing a body to get the data from the world in interactions, not just abstracted out of data points. Yeah, I think that's a good point. That is a fundamentally different thing, I guess. That's the whole argument of embodiment, right? Is that that experience in the body, I think it was like Adam Safron and colleagues just said it's like this. There's this filtering mechanism that happens with things, with using your body. If you have like something like proprioception or interoception, there's this filtering that happens that you only get from having that sensory experience. So you have a bunch of sensors that are collecting data, but that information is being put together in a way that is not just kind of like data points that you can explore or feed forward. Then that's a good point. Then the second comment, there's a very interesting discussion happening with Ilan at Ecolopto at FAU, where he's trying to sort of get in a large language model as a means of showing language, how language is sort of its own thing relative to the mind-body problem, mind-language problem. Yeah. So, I mean, and then of course, there is this role of language in like motor learning and in embodiment that we haven't really talked a lot about, but Jesse would like to speak. So go ahead, Jesse.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Just this. Yeah, I'm trying to think of a way to really get at what I wanted to say. I appreciate what you're doing. The LLM thing I mentioned not because I'm necessarily a proponent of the view, but more like I think it's a nice view in terms of identifying. I don't know if I believe it, but I see what Elon's getting at with his work there, sort of this. There's a structure of the language that is potentially disembodied, and there's like an internal logic to it, which is, I'm not trying to say separate, but like is its own thing, and like that's fine. And it's like, but again, I missed a little bit of things earlier today, but I'm seeing it as like a juxtaposition to the things that you require. I don't really like the words computation here, but like that which requires you to, through your and physical embodiment, get indication. It's like having markers or like kind of like using printed bills, like that you're tracking the thing through it. By going through the medium interaction, you get a specific kind of information and maybe a specific kind of uncertainty reduction. And the last point I wanted to make was like what was very interesting and just now and all this is like we've talked before about like riding a bicycle and ready at hand and how like your mind, you can transfer your sense of self to like, okay, I'm now riding a bicycle, unless something makes me think about that. I will sort of be in it, and then okay, as soon as now I'm not the bicycle anymore. I have to repair it, stop, get out, repair the tire, whatever. That kind of discussion, which I'm very, very roughly referencing here in our previous phenomenological talk, right? And it's sort of like I think, and I assume this maybe is a core of phenomenological discourse in general. But then I was like, okay, well, everything is a version everything you experience is sort of this version of riding the bicycle. It's always the body itself is like the first bicycle. But it doesn't mean you stop it or whatever, or that's less important. But it's like understanding that writing through a pen on a paper will have a specific impact, or like it's more than just the medium. It's the way that the information or the decision structures put through the interface of mediums or mediums plural, and it's like there's a signature by nature of it. I don't think I'm doing a great job of getting at what I'm at, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts or comments on that.
Yeah, this last thing you mentioned, that you perform an action, you have an impact. And we just talked about feedback, actually, in that respect. That's why you have this part of the model where you do something in the world and you see what it does, and then you do something else. Or you have this action part of like entropy minimization or surprisal minimization, which is where to minimize your uncertainty, you have to do things. Like you have to do experiments, or you have to explore the world or something. And so that's the action part. And a lot of like procedural learning is about experience. If I want to ride a bike, I can describe you how to ride a bike, but really to ride a bike, I need to ride the bike. And then I can do it automatically after that because I encode those motions and things like that. And it's not something I can verbally tell you how to do. And then you just do it once and you're done. You have to have the experience. And so that's kind of where this is. So let's move on. Let's see. So this is kind of this decomposition of expected free energy. And so the interpretation of this equation, the G pi function, is that the first term, which is the epistemic value, encourages the agent to take actions that will be informative. Actions that reduce uncertainty about hidden states. So we have hidden states, we have observed states. We don't know all of our hidden states, and that's why we have to reduce our uncertainty. We have to resolve not just the observed states, but the hidden states as well. So, there may be states that we don't really understand what they are, but we know that they're kind of these things in our model that exist, but, we don't know exactly how to interpret. So, and then the second term pushes the agent towards outcomes that are consistent with prior preferences, desired or rewarding outcomes. Okay. And then so together these components drive exploration and exploitation without requiring an explicit reward signal. So this is again where BD knows this quite well, that in reinforcement learning we have these exploration and exploitation models. We also have them in other areas. We have these N-armed bandits. Actually, this came up in the active inference symposium, that people were using N-armed bandits to model exploration and exploitation. In this case, we're using this to not require an explicit reward signal in the model. So that's how they're doing this. So a lot of connections with reinforcement learning. The argument here is that it improves upon reinforcement learning by having this action state. And so then they talk about cognition as dynamical inference and state space. And so thinking about this as a dynamical system. And so then they talk about different neural dynamics. So you have these recurrent neural dynamics, and this is kind of how the brain is dealing with the production of these kinds of predictions and the production of integrating evidence and all that. So they say such recurrent neural dynamics, whether oscillatory, chaotic, or metastable, can be formalized as solutions to differential equations that govern the temporal evolution of beliefs. So these are like where we're describing our beliefs about the world as in these form of these differential equations that are going to become these dynamical trajectories, and then we want to understand how those evolve. So if we think about this in continuous time, we get this differential equation here where we have this gradient term, and then we're subtracting that from this function mu, and then so we have like this first term here, and this is a triplet function, describes how beliefs will evolve over time based on prior expectations of natural dynamics. So I guess this is the mean behavior, the sum behavior, and then x, which is your sort of your current observation. And then this is over this gradient, which is this f, which I believe fits into, I don't see it. Anyways, and so the first term, this function part, this first part of this equation describes how beliefs would evolve over time based on prior expectations or natural dynamics, or how the brain expects things to change even without new sensory input. So say you like know things, and then you stop observing the world, you put on a blindfold, you put your fingers in your ears, and then you kind of just think about the world, or you don't learn anything new. So this is where maybe you come up with a new solution, but not based on experience, just based on this kind of processing of what's there. The second term acts as a corrective force. This is this term here, adjusting beliefs to reduce prediction errors and improve the fit between the brain's model and the actual sensory input. So there's this gradient term where you have this correction. It's basically going down, it's minimizing along this gradient, and it's saying, okay, your beliefs need to be adjusted to get rid of these prediction errors because there's some things that don't make sense. So maybe we need to take our fingers out of our ears, take off our blindfold, and go explore the world, and that exploration will get us down the gradient to the minimal point, or the minimization point. So this is just thinking about these neural dynamics in a similar way, right? So we have this basic paradigm of how we have, like, we're predicting from priors or producing a posterior. That posterior then is being minimized with respect to maybe experience or action. And so this is, again, so this is great. We're formalizing this mathematically, and then we're putting this in terms of like a set of neural mechanisms, and then we're looking at the dynamical systems output. So we can see that this is very easy to implement in like an agent, where you have to produce a behavior of some type, a coherent behavior. So that's what we have here. So the implication is profound. General intelligence and biological agents do not arise from learning specific input-output mappings or storing specific task solutions. Instead, it emerges from a capacity for continual, structured inference, dynamically estimating latent causes, updating beliefs over time, and selecting actions to minimize future uncertainty. So, from this perspective, we're not looking for a fixed algorithm, but a dynamical system for approximate inference in deep, uncertain, non-stationary environments. So basically, those environments where some people say you need a world model for. In the case of our transformer, a transformer would have problems with what we call out of distribution data. But this is, of course, maybe a solution to this, because we don't need to worry about thinking about those things as outliers or as hard problems. It's just a problem of experience. And we put an agent in the world, just let it explore and kind of construct its own minimize solutions to things, and find the optimal solution to it. So that's kind of what we're getting at here. So crucially, predictive coding and active inference provide more than a descriptive theory of neural computation. They offer a mechanistic template for constructing artificial systems that can reason, plan, and adapt in the same situated, embodied manner as human agents. And so this is kind of where they get into the limits of deep learning and predictive coding. So this is actually maybe relevant to our idea about post-transformer architectures. Thinking about how, we've had a lot of success with like large language models and convolutional neural networks. But deep learning, of course, is constrained in several respects. And they cite these here. They generalize poorly beyond their training distribution. They struggle to represent uncertainty in a principled way, and they lack the capacity for continual online adaptation. They're also reactive rather than proactive. They don't infer hidden causes, construct internal models of the environment, or select actions based on long-term expectations. So this is where they kind of talk about this, the core operating principles of these types of models and contrast them with the kind of model they're proposing here. So one of their points is that whereas conventional deep learning systems rely on static feed-forward mappings, optimized via backpropagation, predictive coding systems perform ongoing hierarchical inference over latent causes with uncertainty estimation and action selection embedded in the same inferential loop. Not just minimizing uncertainty, but we're selecting from actions, and we're doing all that in one shot. So there have been some developments such as recurrent architectures, uncertainty-aware models, and online fine-tuning that have begun to chip away at this deficit of sort of the traditional deep learning approach and its drawbacks. Nevertheless, predictive coding and active inference provide a unified, biologically grounded framework in which inference, learning, and behavior emerge from a single underlying principle, which is the minimization of variational free energy. And so that's kind of what their argument is. Actually, this is a nice table. This is contrasting deep learning systems with predictive coding and active inference architectures. So this is kind of getting at the different aspects of these systems and then kind of how they do this differently. So the first aspect is core principle. In deep learning approaches, you have pattern recognition from data. In predictive coding, active inference, we have inferences over latent causes. So that's a difference in terms of how data is dealt with, which is important. And this doesn't necessarily mean you need experience. What this is arguing is that you have these latent sort of causes. You have these things that are possible, but we have to go out and explore and see if those things are actually the cause or not. So I could say, if I see the sunrise in the east in the morning, I could have a number of hypotheses for why that happens, but I can't know for sure until I test all of them. In the deep learning paradigm, I would only be able to verify things based on observed data. So I'd have to go out and have data about the curvature of the Earth, and then like how the Earth turns on its axis and all of that. If I don't have that, then those sorts of things aren't plausible. Whereas if I experience it, I can go out and do natural experiments, and I can experience my world and kind of come to a conclusion about that. And then, of course, that's transferable. It's not just something that is, you have enough training data and you can triangulate that one thing, and then that doesn't generalize to anything else. Okay, then there's the architecture, which of course in deep learning is where we have feed-forward static layers. And in predictive coding, we have hierarchical, recurrent, and dynamic architectures. So we have a wider range of architectures. Learning mechanisms. In deep learning, we have gradient descent on loss functions. We use things like cross-entropy to look at measure that. And then in predictive coding, we have minimization of variational free energy. So we still have a gradient, but the gradient is, not, it's basically like minimizing the available options until we get to like the only thing left. Whereas in deep learning, we're basically minimizing the training error. And, we don't necessarily know if our, what our training data represents. So all we know is that there's this loss and we're trying to minimize it. Uncertainty handling in deep learning, it's often implicit or approximate, so we use something like dropout. In predictive coding, we use explicit via precision-weighted errors and variational posterior. So it's just a fancier approach to uncertainty handling. And of course, this is again part of this conditional probability, right? We have a prior. The prior will represent, kind of like the same thing as sort of a training data set in deep learning, but then we refine that through observations, and then we have these posteriors which represent beliefs about the world, and then we kind of refine all of that over time in a way that's not like optimizing, it's just kind of through experience. Adaptivity, in the case of deep learning, we have retraining or fine-tuning that's required. In active inference, we have online inference over fixed model structure, adaptation without retraining. Action selection in deep learning models is typically via separate reinforcement learning modules, so kind of another model has to deal with that. And then action selection is often done through reinforcement learning. In active inference, action selection is usually unified with perception via expected free energy. So the expected free energy term is the thing that does action selection. And it's integrated with that model in the sense that it's all taken into account kind of as part of that experience. World models. In deep learning, we have discriminative input to output mappings. In active inference, we have generative world models, which simulates the causes and consequences of things. I don't know if that's necessarily true for deep learning, where you have just simply the input to output mappings. I don't know if it would be the world model. Maybe it's kind of like I guess it would be the world model. But I think when people talk about world models in machine learning, they're kind of talking about this thing here, this latter thing. And then this is kind of the thing that results. So, you have like your training data, and then the network represents something, which is this input to output mapping. So it's like, okay, this is the space. If you have these inputs, you get these outputs. And then there's this thing on top that people want to build called a world model, which is kind of generative. So like the things that we were doing in our special issue, that's what they were getting at, is that, if you look at the Hahn Schmidt-Huber paper on world models, they talk about how they have a race car that they teach to kind of understand its universe of scenes in the simulation. And that's their world model. It's generative, but it also, it's kind of like also mapping things to an outcome. So it's a kind of a little bit different way of thinking. But anyways, they make this distinction because in active inference, you're actually actively doing like exploration. You're simulating what the consequences of something are, and you're able to give a bound on that a little bit better. Generalization in deep learning, it's often brittle under distribution, often brittle under distribution shift. So you can only generalize what you have a prior distribution for in deep learning. So if you have data and the data kind of match some other task, then you can make a generalization. If it doesn't, if there has to be some inference made, it's often pretty brittle. It doesn't make that generalization very well. And then in active inference, generalization is potentially more robust by a structured inference and uncertainty modeling. So this is where we have this. The claim is that generalization is improved with this sort of integrated model with experience, with exploration given a prior distribution of beliefs, that sort of thing. I don't know if I buy it. I mean, I'd have to see some sort of test. But yeah. And then biologic plausibility. In deep learning, it's loosely inspired. So if you use a convolutional hierarchy, that's supposedly biologically plausible. But in active inference, we explicitly map things to cortical microcircuits and neuromodulation. Okay, so I don't really want to spend too much more time on this. Let's see if I can get down to maybe some of the latter parts here. So they just basically talk about some of the variational models. And they kind of get into dynamic causal modeling here, which is something that they draw from for their variational Laplace. They talk about learning and adaptation under the free energy principle. They talk about active inference in 2D Pong, which actually is a good, I think, test case because it shows exactly how you can take active inference agents and put them into the world, although that's a pretty basic example. So they implemented a minimal active inference agent to control a paddle in a 2D Pong environment. This is where you have a paddle that moves up and down, and you have to bounce the ball off the paddle. And, that's kind of the task. And so this is, again, something that reinforcement learning can do quite well, especially with something like dish brain, where you have your dish brain, which is a cell culture, and then it's using these feedback signals to predict where the ball is and move the paddle. And so they're using an active inference agent for this. Here, in each time step, the agent receives visual observation of the current ball and paddle positions and uses variational Laplace to infer the most likely hidden states of the environment. So those hidden states are things like the ball's velocity at any given time, or maybe how the ball will refract off of your opponent's paddle and make that prediction. So this is a generative model that was hand specified and includes simplified physical dynamics that govern how the ball and paddle evolve over time. So you need to have a set of observation of physical dynamics. You need to have prior distribution of physical dynamics. In physics, that's easy, but of course you have to have that and you have to have information about all possible hidden states. So if the ball bounces in a weird way, it has to be, you have to be able to predict that interaction and you can do this if you have enough prior, data in your prior distribution, or if you have that experience. But if you don't have that experience, you simply can't do it. And this is, again, kind of contrasting this with training data sets. So, if you're talking about prior distributions and experience, how does that improve over a training set? Well, I guess it does if you have a really good prior and really good experience. But if you don't, then it's a little bit of a problem. So this just kind of goes through comparing this with reinforcement learning approaches, which typically learn policies from external reward signals via trial and error. And so that's where, you're just like, you have an agent that's learning things through trying different things. And if it's getting an error, try something else. This agent uses a model-based inference-driven strategy. Its behavior emerges from the minimization of variational and expected free energy, enabling online adaptation and uncertainty-aware decision-making without task-specific supervision or reward shaping. So this is the perception-action loop in this table 2. There's an observation model, which is this equation here. It's additive. State inference, which allows you to, this is variational Laplace, which allows you to infer different states of being. Then there's action selection, which has this minimization function. And then your state transition model, which is how do you move from state to state. And that's what you need for that. Okay, so that's kind of contrasting that with reinforcement learning. I kind of glossed over the difference between reinforcement learning doing trial and error and I wouldn't say it's trial and error of the active inference model, but we talked about the mathematical underpinnings already, so you get a sense of how that differs. And then, of course, we're going towards neuro-inspired AGI architectures, where we have these key design principles. We have generative models, which maintain internal probabilistic models that generate sensory inputs from latent states. So we have this joint function PXZ. X is latent states, Z is supporting, or X are the sensory inputs, Z is the latent states, and these support simulation, counterfactual reasoning, and belief updating. Then we have this hierarchical structure, so we have our internal representation, which is layered, where the high-level beliefs generate top-down predictions and low-level sensory data propagate bottom-up prediction errors, like a complex adaptive system. Online variational inference, which is where we use real-time algorithms such as variational Laplace to continually update beliefs in MUT about hidden causes in response to new sensory data. Precision weighting. Then we have this active inference loop, which selects actions AT that minimize expected free energy, the G pi, unifying exploration, which is the epistemic value, and the goal pursuit, which is the instrumental value, in a principled way, which I don't know if that's really true, but yeah. However, planning via expected free energy minimization remains computationally demanding. And then this is the problem where we find out that, yeah, this is really hard to do in an agent's computational abilities. I mean, you don't want to have something that really takes a long time to run in a real-time setting. Then there's continual learning and plasticity, where we adapt the parameters theta of the generative model over time to minimize long-term free energy. Unlike belief updating, this form of structural learning is non-trivial and remains an active research frontier. So they give an example of their Pong game here,